welcome to Fourth Estate. This is the program where we tackle all things media and journalism right here on ZTN Prime. And I'm your host, Wadzanai Sansole. Thank you very much for tuning in. Now, today on Fourth Estate, we shift our focus to rural versus urban reporting in Zimbabwe. The media plays a crucial role in shaping public perception, informing citizens, and promoting development. Yet a persistent concern continues to surface. That's the imbalance between rural and urban reporting. Although the majority of Zimbabwe's population resides in rural areas, critics argue that media coverage remains heavily skewed towards urban centers such as Harare, Mutare, Bulawayo, and journalists are predominantly based in cities. Editorial decisions often reflect the priorities and events of urban life. As a result, stories from rural areas are underrepresented unless, of course, they involve natural disasters or events of national significance. However, there are encouraging signs of progress as we've been moving on. Community radio stations such as Ntepe Manama FM, Chimanimani FM, and others are working to amplify rural voices, often broadcasting in local languages, focusing on grassroots concerns. So today on Fourth Estate, we're asking, is the Zimbabwean media doing enough to ensure balanced reporting across rural and urban communities? In what ways can rural stories be amplified for development and growth in all these areas? And as usual, to have this conversation, I'm joined by guests in the studio. I've got Professor Ruby Magoshongwe. She's the chairperson from Zimbabwe Media Commission, and Sifas Muvuta, Programs Officer from Zimbabwe Association of Community Radio Stations. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Watsanai, for having us.
Great. So our topic today is rural versus urban reporting in Zimbabwe. Is the coverage gap narrowing? And this is the first part of this conversation because there's obviously a lot to unpack when it comes to this discussion. So rural-urban information divide, news coverage gap, is it narrowing? Let's get started, and I'll ask both of you. When we look at urban newsrooms undeniably dominating Zimbabwe's media landscape, and some being attributed to issues of proximity and logistics and things like that, why do you think everyday rural life remains largely invisible in mainstream media coverage? And what does this say about the values and priorities within our newsrooms? I'll start with you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Wadzanai. I'm glad that you've already indicated this disparity between rural and urban, coverage in terms of news and events. Let me quickly point out the fact that we cannot rule out the issue of the economic benefits, arising, with the different media players. We are seeing and looking at the media house owners themselves providing, yes, they're providing a service, but it costs money. They are not doing it for charity. So in that regard, the fact that the newsrooms are mostly urban-centric, that's where their, biggest clientele is actually, harnessed or is domiciled. Hence this, can I say, bias towards the urban stories getting prominence where most media houses, private media houses are concerned. However, as far as the public broadcaster is concerned, you've indicated that where we have national disasters, national, events of a national significance, that's where we mostly find the public broadcaster actually covering the rural story. But it is kind of ironic that much as they are covering a rural story, the consumers within the local, the local, can I say, local pressings or the local area where the news itself is covered, in the majority of cases are not covered. And in my view, it still, presents a story that doesn't give the balance that we would expect to get from a national broadcaster, because it is supposed to be impartial in terms of the coverage of whatever, stories of a national nature they are covering. It is unfortunate, in my view, that in the majority of cases we've seen where the big politicians are, or where the presidium is, that's when we tend to get a rural story, so to speak. But the day-to-day, stories that affect the rural communities don't seem to be covered as much as we would expect by the national broadcaster.
Okay, so Cephas, when you look at...
Yeah, it could be a question of resources. I'm not sure, but that seems to have been, the trend. And in the end, or in the final analysis, we end up with some kind of skewed, reporting, because it is very critical for us to hear the voices of the rural folks within the communities where those national events would actually be taking place.
Okay. Thank you for that. And then, so Cephas, when you look at all these editorial biases that she's just brought up, what's your comment on that?
Yeah, sure, there's been that unfair balance in terms of the coverage, the rural and the urban. I think it hinges on two pillars. First, like the professor mentioned, around economic issues. The second one I can attribute it to regulation. Why am I saying regulation? It is up until 2020 when we started to have the three-tier broadcasting system in Zimbabwe, where we now have these community radio stations domiciled in these underserved communities. So it's something it's still at its infancy, but we are heading the right direction. And they are now covering the stories by the rural people for the rural people. Then when it comes to issues to do with economic situation, broadcasting is capital intensive. So you might find that these urban newsrooms don't have the capacity maybe to cover some of these grassroots stories. Going to the rural areas to cover maybe a budding artist, it might be costly. So it's easier to cover maybe someone here in the urban. There's been a saying, people joke around saying, kugoko news outside Zasvika. It's an indication that there has been that divide.
Okay, so when you look at that divide and this whole dilemma that comes with national papers still having reporters in the rural areas, but maybe still reporting on urban-based publications to suit people in the urban areas, what can be done to sort out this challenge?
I think we are making positive trends. They have been, I've seen the work that ZMC does. They reach out to these communities, even going there to accredit these community-based journalists in the rural areas. It's a positive move, empowering them to actually have that professional feel, to say they can now cover these stories from an urban point of view. What's lacking now is for us to have more media outlets in those rural areas so that they can also cover those issues from the community grassroots level.
Okay, and then Professor Ruby, when you look at what you've raised about urban reporters not truly speaking to rural issues, what can be done to cover that gap?
Much as we may want to focus on the news gatherers themselves, we have to focus on the infrastructure. That is meant to be broadcasting, that is meant to be disseminating, the information. In as much as we have community radio stations, for instance, what kind of radius, do they cover to cover the stories concerning the specific local, community radio station? The restrictions of the distance, the radius that the community radio should be covering in terms of licensing and also in terms of infrastructure become very critical, factors that do affect the coverage of rural stories. So I'm aware that there have been strides in making sure that we have boosters, infrastructure. Transmedia is working on infrastructure that would make, at least the radio waves, go far and wide to cover, as broadly, the communities as broadly as possible. But still much needs to be done. We should not necessarily be focusing on the practitioners without taking into account the place that the infrastructure development itself, takes in terms of, broader information dissemination. So my plea rather is coming from the regulators, ZMC. We know that information is a public good, and it's a right. And some of these stories actually help to enhance and entrench, those rights that citizens would want to, to realize and to recognize. But without the requisite infrastructure, I'm aware the strides have been made. But my plea is that more still needs to be done, so that at least with the requisite infrastructure in place, then we can then focus on our practitioners. They can be capacitated, fine, but without the requisite infrastructure in place, it still remains problematic.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And then, Cephas, when we look at community radio stations and how they've been hailed to be the solution to bridge this divide, how are these stations reshaping the media landscape for rural Zimbabwe and providing a platform for voices that would otherwise remain unheard?
Yeah, they have been making strides, but there are challenges. Like I mentioned, we are still having these teething challenges. Like Professor mentioned, the issue of radius. We have some of these stations broadcasting a mere 10-kilometer radius. So you see, they are not fully realizing their value, and they are not fully benefiting the community. We had an instance in Tepe Manama before, but now they are broadcasting on a wider range. But before, they were just broadcasting in Manama, and the Tepe community was not covered in that range. So these are some of the challenges that we somehow face. Then it comes to the issue of sustainability of funding. You know, they are not also able to cover some of these wide areas because they are not able to pay the journalists, the community journalists. These are just volunteers who go there out of passion and the will to practice this media. So also another issue is that these people are not professionals. The journalists themselves are not professionals. So you find that BAS, ZMC, ZACRAS, and other stakeholders have been thoroughly involved in trying to make sure that they train these community-based journalists so that they have the ethics, they have that professionalism in terms of covering their communities, so that we can have that bridge. Then we can say, yeah, we have actually bridged the gap.
All right. Sounds like there's lots of efforts underway to make sure that this divide is bridged, isn't it? So, Professor, when we look at rural communities being in the front lines of environmental issues, from deforestation and land degradation to the impacts of climate change itself, but reporting on these topics tends to be technical, and maybe the people being affected do not actually have full knowledge on what's happening around them. How pertinent are these issues when reporting for rural communities and then the educational side of it?
Thank you so much, Wadzi, for highlighting that. It has been a major concern in as far as we are concerned as the Zimbabwe, Media Commission, because we have our journalists or practitioners per se, having a multiplicity of disciplines that they're striving to cover. And at the end of the day, one may not be a master of all, the disciplines. So we need to capacitate as the Zimbabwe Media Commission in collaboration perhaps with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, with EMA itself, with the Ministry of Mines, because they are at the, can I say, they are mostly involved in the land degradation that we seem to be finding. Ministry of Lands itself, deforestation and so on. So if we come together, have collaborative efforts, capacitate our journalists. We have sports reporters, for instance. We have those who run with football. We have those who run with those who run with, I wanted to bring in the issue of Olympics, those who are following up cricket, those are following up, basketball, those are following up Olympics and so on. But we don't have any specific, journalists per se running with issues of climate change. We just get to hear about some of these issues only at the time COP15, for instance, that Zimbabwe is coming to host. But there is no sustainable efforts in following up, on those matters.
Why do you think it's like that, though?
Like I indicated at the beginning, the whole issue of resourcing, the media practitioners themselves is very critical. We may take it lightly and then pass on the blame to the owners of the media houses and so on, but they also need to survive. They need to thrive. in the economic environment that we find ourselves in. And it takes fuel. It takes lots of, some may actually quickly point out, but they can have contact persons in the rural areas, in the respective communities. But remember, he has brought up the whole issue of training, ethics, and so on. Whilst we may get some, reports through social media and so on, but that's coming from untrained people who don't know the professional ethics, whether that information will be verified or not. That remains to be debated. Because the whole idea of reporting in a balanced manner is we are focusing on the context, we are focusing on the story, we are focusing on the community itself, and we are focusing on the global nature of the whole story itself and its impact on national development and development of the respective communities. So it's a whole host of factors that come in together to influence the manner in which these stories are then reported and managed. And further to that, it could be the whole issue of certain, journalists or media houses actually being reluctant, to report on sensitive, matters, because I don't know whether it's apprehension or whether it's a question of trying to preserve, their jobs, or whatever reasons, for whatever reasons. We have had the whole issue of mining in Hwange, for instance, which was covered in today's daily news. It has been an issue that has been repeatedly coming up, the balance between mining ventures in a national park and the conservation, the two not actually, working favorably together. And these are issues, like I indicated, that should involve, a whole spectrum of players, so that at least there is an understanding of how certain activities, be it economic, be it entrepreneurial, how they generally and finally impact on the national conservation plan and national heritage, that needs to be, preserved for future generations, not just for us to enjoy in the now and forget about, posterity. So it's a host of, factors that we need to, to bring into focus.
Okay, so how often do issues like interest in a specific topic and exposure to that specific thing, how often does that even come into play? Like if the reporter is interested and has been exposed to that specific topic in the first place, to be equipped enough to be able to report on that?
Perhaps because of the whole issue of managing, resourcing, the newsroom, the personnel in the newsroom, you end up having, I'm not a reporter myself, a news person myself, but you actually have multitasking, within the small, human capital base that the newsrooms and media houses have, in the interest of containing, the costs and managing within whatever resources that they might have. So the idea then would then be for the government. I know people say, who is government? We are the government, we are the people. To actually come in and intervene. I'm not sure that there is a specific budget, set aside for conservation reporting. Specific budget set aside for climate change education and reporting. The whole idea of imagining that, because there's a ministry that is concerned or that is involved, without a specific budget earmarked, will leave things to chance. So it all takes us back to the whole idea of, planning, interministerial task forces and planning coming together, so that at least we have these issues, critical issues, national issues, heritage issues, covered in a broader and more holistic manner.
Okay.
But of course, with the training of our, media players, so that at least once they are capacitated, then cover, meaningfully and in a balanced manner, these are very critical topics or subjects.
All right, and then
Yes.
Cephas, if you look at that aspect of resources coming into play, and then adding on the issue of the argument that comes that rural people are only reported on in times of disaster and become more like passive victims versus them being active participants in society and becoming a part of the story. What are the long-term effects of crisis-driven rural coverage on national perception and policymaking?
Yeah, so that has been the trend for quite some time, where the bad stories are more from the rural side. So we want to change that narrative and have the rural people tell their own stories. And this can be done, like Professor said, through a collaborative effort where we have, if we have issues of national disaster like climate change, we engage EMA and the responsible ministries. Let's collaborate and see how best we can utilize. We view the media outlets as tools for development, so they can be used as tools to develop those communities. And we are really calling upon the ministries and other stakeholders to collaborate with these media houses in the rural areas. These are underserved communities, by the way, and through these tools of development, they can be saved, and we can avoid some of the future crises or situations that can be bad in those communities.
Yeah. Okay, and then so adding on to that, and we look at language barriers, how important is the use of local languages in media coverage?
Very critical. You know, we miss some of these issues because of the language barrier. So what the government is doing, and we are hoping they continue doing, is to increase the number of these, I'll speak from the community radio sector, a number of community radio stations that are there. Currently we have 14 licensed community radio stations, and Zimbabwe has 64 districts, if I'm not mistaken. So it is our hope that every district should have a community radio that broadcasts in the local language. Why should we, why we need that? Because it's easier for someone to understand something when it's explained in their local language as compared to the, maybe we can say, foreign languages. So we're calling upon that. Let's have as many community radio stations in every district so that people get to understand issues close to their hearts, issues in their own language. Then they can also participate in those discourses. Then we can also get solutions from those people from grassroots level.
All right, and then have stories that are more relatable in communities, isn't it?
Exactly.
All right, we shall be taking a short break, but do not go away. Stay tuned.
In a land where traditions run deep, where the soil holds the secrets of generations, and where dreams are sown alongside seeds, a new generation emerges. Welcome to Young Seeds. Get ready to embark on a journey like no other as we shine a spotlight on the dynamic and inspiring young farmers in the heartland of Zimbabwe.
I want to do it because plants will die, plants will get infected by diseases.
I tried to do mixed farming, that is also putting tomatoes. I have half a hectare of tomatoes.
Every 40 days, it has to be giving birth.
Produce a good quality fruit size. Calves are kept in different pens, basically so that they don't spread diseases to each other.
My name is Tariwa Sikauke. I'm a rabbit farmer.
These young farmers are revolutionizing traditional practices, embracing technology, and finding sustainable solutions that will shape the future of agriculture. So, let's get our hands dirty.
Welcome back. You're still tuned into Fourth Estate, the program where we tackle all things media and journalism. And today we're talking about rural versus urban reporting. And as we just round off this first part of this conversation and looking at how all of this type of reporting can affect stories at the end of the day, because you want to produce things that are relatable in communities, isn't it? Could you just quickly just tell us some of the things that you're doing as Zakras to make sure that you bridge the gap and make sure that the stories that are released are relatable in communities?
Well, we are doing a lot of work. I don't know where to start. First, maybe we are doing advocacy. Like I've been saying it, we want more community radio stations. We want community participation. We want to achieve that bottom-up approach where people from the rural communities solve their own problems through these tools of development. So what we are doing as ZACRA is to promote these community radio stations in any way that we can. We mentioned trainings. We are going out there to train these community radio journalists on how they can gather news on issues of specific interest. I'm happy that you mentioned climate change. It's a very technical subject that needs professionals to actually decode. So we are engaging the responsible authorities so that we can train these community radio journalists in areas like Chimanimani, Nyangani, and Garawa, so that they are able to actually serve their communities in a very developmental way.
Okay, and then Professor Ruby, just very quickly, if you could also highlight some of the training programs and support you have for community media so that they can produce inclusive stories.
Okay, thank you so much, Wadzi. I want to take up from where he left the whole issue of having the community, communities getting involved in some of these mega projects, be it developmental, economic, and so on. The whole issue of respecting the sacred, places, the shrines, the rivers, the flays, that kind of thing, would rest, more comfortably with the local communities. They know the mores and the laws that would have helped them to preserve, most of those, can I say, natural resources within their respective locales or communities. So without actually involving the local leadership and the people themselves who are directly, concerned, I think as a country, we'll face a losing battle. The whole idea of decimating and bringing down whole mountain ranges, in the name of investment, in the interest of investment, at the expense of the local communities and preservation of those, natural resources in the long term would make the country lose out. And as far as the training of, let me leave that aside, the whole idea of training, and capacitating the community radio stations and other journalists, we often run this depending on availability of resources. But we have, as the TMC, tried as much as possible to have, I don't know, to have as much coverage as possible of the respective districts that we have done, bring this together. For instance, I may quickly hasten to say, for the 2023 harmonized elections, I know you can say, but you are taking us back, but it's just as a good example. We trained about 1,000 journalists on elections reporting and peace journalism, and you noticed how calm our elections were. And in as far as conservation reporting, climate change reporting is concerned, we are also working, together with partners, funding partners, so that at least we can have this take root. We are also collaborating with ZAC on corruption reporting, and we are in the middle of actually mobilizing resources because corruption has become endemic, in our country.
All right.
Yeah, I could go on and on.
Well, the good thing is we have a part 2 of this conversation, and we get to still continue the conversation on bridging the gap between rural and urban reporting. So thank you very much for staying tuned. You're watching Fourth Estate. I want to thank my guests. I'm joined by Professor Ruby Makoshongwe, the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Media Commission, and Sifas Mumvuta, Programs Officer from Zimbabwe Association of Community Radio Stations. I'm your host, Wadzanai Sansole. We've got part 2 coming up, same time next week.